The Korean Mafia boss had no heart left, and everyone who worked for him knew it, because the last time he'd shown mercy, it had cost him everything he loved. The gunshot cracked through the warehouse like thunder splitting the sky, and the man on his knees didn't even have time to beg before he slumped forward onto the concrete. Choi Min-jae didn't blink. He didn't look away. He tucked the pistol back into his jacket, straightened his cuffs, and turned to the 6 men standing frozen behind him. "Clean this up," he said, in a voice so calm it was almost worse than if he'd screamed.
You should have kept your word.
"And find out who else he was talking to." Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Then everybody moved at once. That was Choi Min-jae in the year this story begins, a man who had built an empire out of shipping containers and silence, who ran one of the most feared operations along the West African coast, and who had not felt a single thing in his chest for almost 15 years. Not fear. Not joy. Not grief. Nothing. But 3 weeks before that gunshot, everything had still been ordinary. And 3 weeks before that gunshot, a 9-year-old girl selling oranges outside his warehouse gate was about to walk into his life and refused to walk back out. Welcome to Afro-k Story House, besties. Say hi in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. If this is your first time here, you are exactly where you need to be. Because this story is going to break you a little before it puts you back together. Before we start, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you do not want to miss what happens in the next 50 minutes. Let's get into it. 3 weeks earlier, Accra was waking up the way it always did, with the smell of frying plantain drifting through the streets, taxis honking at nothing in particular, and the ocean sending a warm, salty wind up through Tema Harbor. Choi Min-jae stood at the window of his office on the 3rd floor of a shipping company that, on paper, exported cocoa and cashews to Busan. In reality, it exported something far more profitable, hidden inside crates that customs officials had long since learned not to open. He had come to Ghana 11 years ago, sent by men in Seoul who wanted a foothold in West Africa and a man cold enough to build one. Choi had been perfect for the job. Too perfect, some said, because a man needs at least a small piece of warmth left in him to build loyalty, and Choi ruled through fear alone. His right hand, a broad-shouldered man named Suk-ho who had known Choi since they were teenagers running errands for a gang in Incheon, stepped into the office and cleared his throat. "The shipment clears customs tomorrow night," Suk-ho said. "Same as always." "Good," Choi said, without turning around. Suk-ho lingered. He always lingered, these days, like he was waiting for Choi to say something more, a joke, a complaint, anything human. Choi never gave him one. "You should eat something," Suk-ho tried. "You didn't touch your food yesterday." "I'm not hungry." "You're never hungry anymore." Choi finally turned, and his eyes were flat and dark, like 2 stones at the bottom of a river. "Is there something else, Suk-ho?" Suk-ho held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. "No, sir." After he left, Choi stood alone in the silence of his office for a long time, staring at nothing. This was his life now. Numbers. Shipments. Punishments. A machine that ran on fear instead of feeling. He told himself it was fine. He told himself a man in his position could not afford softness. He told himself this every single day, and every single day, some small dead part of him whispered that he was lying. He didn't know yet that outside his gate, a little girl in a faded yellow dress was arranging oranges into a small pyramid on a wooden tray, humming to herself, completely unaware that the man behind those tinted windows had killed 3 people that month and felt nothing about any of them. Her name was Adjoa. She was 9 years old, with 2 missing front teeth and a gap-toothed grin she gave to almost everyone, whether they deserved it or not. Every morning, she walked 40 minutes from her family's single room in a cramped compound near the market, carrying a tray of oranges balanced on her head, because her mother's cough had gotten too bad for her mother to carry it herself anymore, and somebody had to sell something if they wanted to eat that week. She had picked the spot outside the shipping company gate 3 months earlier, not because she knew who owned it, but because the security guards there liked her, and one of them, An older man named Kwabena sometimes bought 2 oranges just to give her a little extra. That morning, Kwabena wasn't at his post. A different guard, younger and stricter, chased her off twice before she finally set up near the far corner of the wall, just out of his line of sight but close enough to still catch customers walking to the gate. She didn't know that from the third-floor window, a man with dead eyes had glanced down, seen a small yellow shape moving against the gray concrete, and felt, for just a fraction of a second, something flicker in his chest that he didn't have a name for anymore. He dismissed it immediately. It was nothing. A child. Children were everywhere in this city. He had more important things to think about, like the man who might have talked to the wrong people, and what would need to happen to him if the rumors turned out to be true. By the time the sun was directly overhead, Adjoa had sold 6 oranges. Not enough. Her mother's medicine cost more than 6 oranges could cover, and there were still 4 hours of daylight left, so she stayed, fanning herself with a torn piece of cardboard, watching the gate of the big gray building where important-looking men in suits went in and out all day. That was when she saw him for the first time up close. Choi Min-jae came out of the building flanked by 2 men, walking toward a black car parked at the curb, his face unreadable, his stride precise and unhurried in the way that powerful men walk when they've never had to run from anything. Adjoa didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he did inside that building, or what he had done the week before in a warehouse across the harbor. All she saw was a well-dressed man who looked, to her 9-year-old eyes, like someone who could afford an orange. So she did what she always did. She ran up to him. "Oga, buy orange," she called out, holding up her tray, grinning despite the 2 men who immediately stepped between her and their boss like a wall of muscle and suits. "Get back," one of them snapped in accented English, his hand moving toward her shoulder to push her away. "It's fine," Choi said. The word came out flat, almost bored, but it stopped the guard's hand midair. Choi looked down at the girl, at her tray of oranges, at her missing front teeth and her stubborn, hopeful smile, and something in him, some old rusted door that hadn't opened in 15 years, creaked, just slightly, on its hinges. "How much?" he asked. 2 sadies, Oga. "Very sweet, I promise." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a note far larger than 2 sadies, and handed it to her without taking an orange. Adjoa's eyes went wide. "Oga, this is too much. I will bring change." "Keep it," he said, already turning to get into the car. "Wait," she called after him, and something in her voice, not gratitude, not surprise, but a kind of fierce, childish insistence on fairness, made him pause with one hand on the car door. "You have to take an orange. I don't take money for nothing. My mother says that is how you lose your dignity." The guards froze. Nobody spoke to Choi Min-jae like that. Nobody corrected him, contradicted him, or made demands of him, not without consequences. Suk-ho, standing a few feet away, actually held his breath. Choi turned back slowly. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, buried under 15 years of ice. "Fine," he said. "Give me the orange." She handed it to him with both hands, the way you'd hand someone something precious, and he took it the same way, and then he got into the car and was gone, and Adjoa stood there in the sun, staring at the space where the car had been, wondering why her chest felt strange, like she'd just done something important without knowing what it was. She had no idea. Not yet. Neither did he. If you're enjoying this story so far, do me a quick favor, drop a like on this video right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it lets us know you want more stories like this one. Also, if you have a guess about where this story is going, type it in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let's get back into it, because things are about to get a lot more complicated. That night, Choi sat in his apartment overlooking the harbor, the orange sitting untouched on the kitchen counter, and found himself staring at it like it might explain something to him. He didn't eat fruit anymore. He barely ate at all. But he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He thought about the girl's face. The way she'd looked at him. Not with fear, not with the calculated respect his own men gave him, but with the simple, unguarded directness of someone who had no idea what he was capable of. Nobody looked at him like that anymore. Nobody had, in years. He told himself it meant nothing. A street kid selling fruit outside his office. There were thousands of them across the city. He would forget her by morning. He did not forget her by morning. The next day, he found himself glancing out the window more than usual. By the third day, he was doing it without pretending to himself that he wasn't. And on the fourth day, when Adjoa's yellow dress didn't appear outside the gate at all, something tightened in his chest that felt uncomfortably close to worry, an emotion he had not permitted himself in a very long time. She showed up the next morning instead, limping slightly, with a scrape on her knee. Chased by a dog, she explained cheerfully, when Choi, against every instinct of self-preservation his 15 years of hardness had built, actually walked over to where she sat and asked what happened. "It's fine, Olga. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't be used to being chased by dogs," he said. She shrugged, the universal gesture of a child who has learned that complaining changes nothing. Life is life. That phrase stayed with him longer than it should have. Life is life. Coming from a grown man, it would have sounded like resignation. Coming from a 9-year-old with a scraped knee and a tray of oranges, it sounded like defiance dressed up as acceptance, and he didn't know what to do with the fact that it moved him. Over the following 2 weeks, something began to shift, quietly, almost against Choi's will. He started coming down to the gate himself instead of sending someone to buy fruit. He started asking her questions, not out of politeness, but because he genuinely wanted to know the answers. Where did she live? Did she go to school? What happened to her father? He left, Adjoa told him one afternoon, matter of fact, no self-pity in her voice at all. Before my little brother was born. My mama says some men are built to run when things get heavy. I don't think about him. Do you go to school? Sometimes. When there's money for the fees and I'm not needed for selling. She said it the way she said everything, like a fact of weather, not a wound. I want to be a doctor one day. My mama coughs a lot. I want to fix that. Choi said nothing to that. He was thinking about his own mother, a memory he hadn't let himself touch in over a decade, a small apartment in Incheon, the smell of instant noodles, a woman who worked 3 jobs and still found time to braid his sister's hair every morning before school. He hadn't thought about his sister's hair in 15 years. He didn't understand why he was thinking about it now, standing in the Accra sun, listening to a street child talk about her dreams of becoming a doctor. Sukho noticed the change before anyone else did, because Sukho had known Choi long enough to remember what he used to look like before the ice set in. He noticed it in small things, the way Choi lingered by the window in the mornings, the way he'd started asking the guards to let the girl through when the new one tried to chase her off, the way, once, Sukho swore he heard something in the office that sounded almost like laughter. He didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. In their world, softness got people killed. He'd seen it happen before, years ago, to a boss and soul who'd let his guard down for a mistress and ended up with a bullet in the back of his head for it. Love, attachment, weakness, in this life, they weren't sentimental words. They were liabilities with a body count. You should be careful, Sukho said one evening, as they reviewed the week's shipments. People are starting to talk. Choi didn't look up from the papers. Talk about what? The girl. Word travels, sir. If our rivals hear that Choi Min-jae has a soft spot, he stopped himself, choosing his words carefully. It's not safe. For her. Or for you. For a long moment, Choi said nothing. Then, quietly, noted. But he didn't stop. That was the thing about a heart waking up after 15 years of sleep, it didn't ask permission. It didn't care about strategy or safety or the careful architecture Choi had built his entire existence around. It simply woke up, aching and unfamiliar, and once it was awake, there was no putting it back to sleep. 3 days later, Adjoa didn't show up at the gate. Not that morning, not the next. Choi told himself it was nothing. Children miss days. She probably had schoolwork, or her mother needed her at home, or a dozen other harmless explanations. But by the third day, the not knowing had become unbearable in a way he hadn't felt about anything in 15 years, and he found himself doing something he never did, leaving the office in the middle of the afternoon, telling his driver to take him toward the market district, toward the compound Adjoa had once mentioned in passing. He found the building. A cramped, low structure with peeling paint, shared by several families, laundry strung between windows. He stood outside for a moment, aware of how strange he must look, a man in a tailored suit, standing in an alley in a neighborhood like this, and then he knocked. A tired-looking woman opened the door, and behind her, on a thin mattress on the floor, Adjoa lay curled up, pale and sweating. "She has a fever," the woman said, eyeing him warily. "Who are you?" "I buy oranges from her," Choi said, which was true and also somehow completely inadequate to explain why he was standing there. Adjoa's mother, Afro-k, he would later learn her name was, studied him for a long moment, the exhausted, suspicious look of a woman who had learned not to trust well-dressed men who showed up at her door unannounced. "We don't need charity," she said. "I'm not offering charity." He glanced past her at the girl on the mattress. "What's wrong with her?" "Malaria, we think. The clinic wants money we don't have." "Not yet, anyway. I'm still saving." Something cold and decisive settled over Choi's face. Not the coldness of the killer he'd become, but something older, something that had once belonged to a boy in Incheon who used to give his lunch to kids who had none. "Get her to the clinic," he said. "Now. I'll cover it." Afua opened her mouth to refuse, out of pride, out of caution, out of the deep instinct that told her nothing given so easily by a stranger came without a hidden cost. But Adjoa, weak and feverish, lifted her head slightly and managed a small, knowing smile. "He's not bad, Mama," she murmured. "He gave me too much money for an orange once and made me feel bad about it. That, somehow, was enough." Afua let him help. It's story time here at Afro-k Story House, and if this is the kind of story that makes your chest tighten a little, don't scroll away yet, the biggest twists are still coming. Drop a comment telling us who you think Adjoa reminds Choi of. Some of you might already have a guess, and trust me, you're closer than you think. Let's continue. Adjoa recovered within a week, thanks to proper medicine and a clinic bill that Choi paid without a second thought, an amount of money that, to him, was nothing, and to Afua, was the difference between her daughter living and possibly not. When Adjoa returned to her spot outside the gate, tray of oranges balanced on her head as always, she found Choi waiting by the wall, arms crossed, trying and failing to look like he hadn't been checking the street every 10 minutes for a week. "You came to see me," she said, delighted, as if she'd caught him at something. "I came for oranges," he said. "You always say that." She grinned her gap-toothed grin. "But you never actually eat them." "I've seen the pile on your car seat. Suko told me." Choi shot a look toward his lieutenant, who was suddenly very interested in something on the other side of the street. Over the following weeks, the visits became something neither of them named out loud but both understood. Choi began arranging for a portion of Adjoa's school fees to be quietly covered, not directly, because he understood, in some instinctive way, that a man like him giving money too visibly to a child like her would draw exactly the kind of attention Suko had warned him about. He set it up through an intermediary, a small scholarship fund that the school believed came from a corporate donor. Adjoa didn't need to know where it came from. She just needed to go to school. He started eating again, a little. Suko noticed that too, and said nothing, though the relief on his face was obvious to anyone paying attention. One evening, sitting on an overturned crate near the gate while Adjoa packed up her unsold oranges, Choi found himself telling her something he hadn't told another living soul in 15 years. "I had a sister," he said, staring out at the darkening harbor. "Younger than me. She used to wait for me outside school every day, the same way you wait outside this gate. Adjoa looked up, sensing the shift in his voice. What happened to her? Choi was quiet for a long moment. There was a fire. At our apartment. I wasn't there. I was out with people I shouldn't have been with. By the time I got back, he stopped. His jaw tightened. I told myself, after that caring about people was a weakness. That if I never let myself feel anything for anyone again, I could never lose anything again either. It seemed like a reasonable trade, at the time. Adjoa was quiet, absorbing this with the strange gravity children sometimes have when adults finally tell them the truth. That sounds lonely, she said finally. It was efficient, he corrected. My mama says lonely and efficient are just two names for the same sad thing. She said it simply, without any awareness of how deeply the words landed, and Choi felt something crack open in his chest that he hadn't allowed to crack in 15 years. You talk like you're 40, he said, half a laugh escaping him, an actual laugh, rusty and unfamiliar, the first one Suk-ho had heard from him in years, watching quietly from a distance by the car. I have to, Adjoa said. Somebody in my family has to be the strong one, and Mom is tired. So I practice being strong until I really am. Choi looked at her for a long moment, this small, fierce, unbroken child who had every reason to be bitter and somehow wasn't, and understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he had let himself love her. Not in some abstract, charitable way. Genuinely. The way he had once loved his sister, before the fire, before the 15 years of ice. And loving someone, in his world, was the single most dangerous thing a man in his position could do. He should have listened to that fear. He didn't, not fully, not in time, and 3 days later, the consequences of that softness arrived at his door in the form of a name he hadn't heard in years, Kong. Kong Do-yoon ran a rival operation out of Lagos, a man Choi had clashed with twice before over shipping routes, and a man who had spent the last several months looking for any weakness in Choi's operation that could be exploited. Weakness, in their world, didn't need to be financial. A rumor was enough. And the rumor that had reached Kang's ears, carried, perhaps, by someone within Choi's own organization who'd grown resentful of his softening, or perhaps simply by careless talk among the guards, was this: Choi Min-jae, the coldest boss on the West African coast, had gone soft over a street child. To Kong, this wasn't sentimental gossip. It was opportunity. The next morning, Choi arrived at his office to find Suk-ho waiting with a look on his face that made Choi's stomach drop before a single word was spoken. What happened? Choi said. Not a question. A demand. Suk-ho held up his phone, showing a photo that had been sent to their private line overnight, a photo of Adjoa, taken from a distance, walking home from school, completely unaware she was being watched. Underneath it, a message, in clipped, deliberate English: pretty girl. Careful what you love, Choi. Things you love have a way of disappearing in this business. The room went very quiet. Choi stared at the photo for a long time, and when he finally looked up, the coldness that came over his face wasn't the dead, empty coldness of the man who had once shot someone without blinking. It was something worse, the focused, terrible calm of a man who had just realized he had something to lose, and would do anything, absolutely anything, to keep it. Find her, he said. Now. Get her and her mother somewhere safe. I don't care what it costs. Suk-ho was already moving. But Kong had been planning longer than they realized. If your heart is racing right now, that means this story is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. This is the halfway point, besties, and I need you to do 2 things for me: subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with one person you think would enjoy it. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Now brace yourself, because what happens next changes everything. By the time Suk-ho's men reached the school, Adjoa was already gone. Not kidnapped in some dramatic, cinematic way, simply gone, walked out the gate at the end of the day the same as always, and vanished somewhere on the ordinary, crowded walk home that thousands of children made every afternoon without incident. Except this afternoon wasn't ordinary. A car had been waiting. A woman claiming to be a family friend had approached her with a note supposedly from her mother. Adjoa, trusting and unsuspecting, had gone. Afro-k called Choi's number, a number Choi had given her weeks earlier, quietly, in case of emergencies, in a state of pure panic, her voice breaking apart mid-sentence. "She's not home. She's never late. Something is wrong, I know something is wrong." Choi was already in the car before she finished the sentence. What followed was the most dangerous 48 hours of Choi Min-jae's life, and he had lived through plenty of dangerous days. Kang's message came within the hour, delivered not through fear or threats but through cold, business-like terms, as if he were negotiating a shipping contract instead of holding a child hostage. "The girl is safe, for now. You will hand over your northern shipping routes and your contacts at customs. Do this, and she goes home unharmed. Refuse, and you will learn exactly how little I care about sentiment." Suk-ho watched Choi read the message, watched the muscles in his jaw work, watched 15 years of careful, controlled ice threaten to shatter into something far more volatile. "We give him the routes," Suk-ho said carefully. "We rebuild. Routes can be replaced. I know what she can't be replaced with," Choi said, quiet and lethal. "That's not the plan." "Then what is?" Choi looked at him, and for the first time in 15 years, Suk-ho saw something in his boss's eyes that wasn't calculation. It was fear, real, human, unguarded fear, the kind that comes only from loving something enough to be terrified of losing it. "We're not trading her for territory," Choi said. "We're getting her back. And then I'm going to make sure Kong never threatens anyone again." That night, Choi did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He called in every favor, every alliance, every debt owed to him across 3 countries, not for profit, not for power, but for a 9-year-old girl who sold oranges outside his gate and once made him buy one instead of just handing her money. Men who hadn't heard from Choi Min-jae in years found themselves receiving calls at midnight, and every single one of them, hearing the tone in his voice, understood this wasn't a request. It was the last request they would ever get the chance to refuse. By dawn, they had a location, a compound on the outskirts of the city, one of Kang's lesser-known safe houses, identified through a contact Choi had helped years earlier and never once called upon for a favor, until now. Choi didn't send his men in alone. He went himself, something Suk-ho tried, uselessly, to argue him out of. "You're the boss," Suk-ho said. "You don't go into a situation like this yourself. That's what the rest of us are for." "Not this time," Choi said, checking the pistol at his side with hands that were, for the first time in 15 years, not entirely steady. "This time it's mine to finish." The compound was quiet when they arrived, too quiet, the kind of quiet that meant either an ambush or an empty trap. Choi moved through it with the precision of a man who had spent his entire adult life around violence, but every step forward, his mind wasn't on tactics or exit strategies. It was on a small, gap-toothed smile and a voice saying life is life, like it was nothing at all, like being brave was as simple as choosing it. They found her in a back room, sitting on a bare mattress, hands tied loosely in front of her, more furious than frightened. Adjoa had apparently spent the last several hours lecturing her captors on the importance of dignity and had gotten one of the younger guards, guilty and unnerved, to loosen her ropes and slip her extra food. When she saw Choi in the doorway, her face broke into the widest, most relieved smile he had ever seen, and something in his chest. That same rusted door that had first creaked open weeks ago over a tray of oranges, finally swung all the way open. "I knew you'd come," she said, like it had never been a question. But it wasn't over. A shout went up from outside, they'd been found. Kang's men, more of them than expected, closing in from 2 directions. Suk-ho grabbed Choi's arm. "We need to move, now." Gunfire cracked outside, and for one terrible, suspended second, Choi had to make the choice that 15 years of careful, controlled isolation had been built specifically to avoid, the choice of putting everything, including his own life, on the line for someone else. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed Adjoa, pulled her behind him, and moved. What happened over the next several minutes would later be described by the few men who survived it as something closer to a storm than a gunfight. Choi Min-jae, the boss who had spent 15 years feeling nothing, fighting with the ferocity of a man who suddenly, desperately, had everything to lose. Suk-ho and the others cleared a path toward the compound's rear exit, and Choi carried Adjoa through it himself, her small arms locked around his neck, her face pressed into his shoulder, both of them alive when it seemed, for several unbearable minutes, like they might not be. They made it to the car. Made it out onto the open road, the compound shrinking behind them, gunfire fading into the distance, and only then, only when he was certain they were safe, did Choi Min-jae, a man who had not cried once in 15 years, not at his sister's funeral, not at his own mother's, not once in all that time, feel something hot and unfamiliar sting behind his eyes. Adjoa, still shaking slightly in his arms, looked up at him. "Are you crying, Oga?" "No," he said, his voice thick. "You are." "It's okay. My mama says it's okay for strong people to cry. It just means the strong part finally caught up with the sad part." Choi Min-jae, the coldest boss on the West African coast, laughed and cried at the exact same time, and did not care, for the first time in 15 years, who saw him do it. The story doesn't end there, besties, there's still a real cost to be paid, and I don't want you to miss how this all resolves. If you're new here, now's the perfect time to hit subscribe, because this channel drops stories just like this one every single week. Stay with me, because the ending is coming, and it's not what you expect. Kang Do-yoon did not survive the fallout of what came next. Word of what he had done, kidnapping a child to leverage against a rival, spread quickly through a criminal world that, for all its brutality, had its own unspoken codes, and even men who feared Choi Min-jae found themselves unwilling to defend an operation that had crossed that particular line. Within a month, Kang's own organization turned on him, his allies abandoned him, and the details of his downfall never fully reached Choi's desk, because Choi, for the first time in 15 years, had stopped caring about the machinery of power entirely. He returned Adjoa to her mother that same night, staying only long enough to watch Afro-k pull her daughter into an embrace fierce enough to crack ribs, both of them sobbing, both of them alive. He stood in the doorway of that small, cramped room, a man in a blood and dust-streaked suit who had just fought his way through gunfire for a child who wasn't even his own, and understood, with a clarity that reordered everything he thought he knew about himself, that the empire he'd spent 11 years building meant absolutely nothing to him compared to the sight of that little girl safe in her mother's arms. "Thank you," Afro said to him over Adjoa's shoulder, her voice raw. "I don't know what you are, or what you do in that building. I don't want to know. But thank you." Choi nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment, and turned to leave. "Wait," Adjoa said, pulling free of her mother's arms just enough to run to him and wrap her small arms around his waist, the way she'd wrapped them around his neck in the car, except this time out of pure, uncomplicated gratitude rather than fear. "You're not just an orange customer anymore," she said, muffled against his jacket. "You're family now. You don't get to leave." Something in Choi's chest, some final piece of the ice that had encased him for 15 years, finally, completely, melted. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and meant it more than he had meant anything in a very long time. In the months that followed, Choi Min-jae did not become a different man overnight. That isn't how real change works, and this story wouldn't be honest if it pretended otherwise. He was still the head of a shipping operation that dealt in things far darker than cocoa and cashews. He still carried the weight of everything he'd done in 15 years of ice. But something fundamental in him had shifted, permanently, irreversibly, the way a locked door shifts once you finally find the key. He began, slowly, quietly, to change how his operation ran. Pulling back from the more brutal enforcement methods that had once been his signature, redirecting resources toward the legitimate side of the shipping business, telling himself and Suk-ho both that a smarter operation was simply a more sustainable one, though everyone around him understood the real reason. He set up, formally this time, a proper scholarship fund. Not just for Adjoa, but for a dozen other children in her neighborhood, administered honestly, without hidden strings, Because a man who had learned what one child's life was worth could no longer look away from the others. Adjoa did go to school, consistently now, fees never a question again. She still sold oranges some afternoons, not out of necessity anymore, but because she said she liked talking to people, and because, she told Choi with her same gap-toothed grin, someone taught me that dignity means not taking things for nothing. She visited him at the office sometimes, marching past guards who now waved her through without question, plopping herself into the chair across from his desk to tell him about her day, her teachers, her plans to become a doctor and fix her mother's cough for good. So-ko, watching all of this unfold from the sidelines, said to him once, quietly, "You know this isn't how our world usually ends. Soft men don't survive long in this business." "I know," Choi said. "Doesn't scare you?" Choi thought about the gunfire, the compound, the moment he'd chosen to run toward danger instead of away from it, the feeling of Adjoa's arms around his neck, the tears he hadn't cried in 15 years finally breaking free on an empty road at dawn. "I spent 15 years being scared of nothing," he said, "because I let myself feel nothing. I'd rather be scared of something real than safe from everything that matters." So-ko didn't have an answer for that. He didn't need one. Years later, when people in that part of Accra told this story, and they did tell it, in the way that neighborhoods tell the stories that matter to them, softened and shaped a little differently each time, they didn't talk about the shipping routes or the gunfire or the man Kong Duyun had once been. They talked about a little girl in a yellow dress who sold oranges outside a gate, and a mafia boss who had forgotten how to feel anything at all, until the day she made him buy one instead of just handing her the money. They said it wasn't really about the orange. It was about dignity, and about the small, stubborn insistence of a child who refused to let a broken man stay broken, simply because she believed, without any evidence at all, that he didn't have to be. Choi Min-jae had no heart left, the story goes. Until a Ghanaian girl walked in, and reminded him he'd only ever misplaced it. And that, besties, is the end of our story tonight. If this one hit you right in the chest the way it hit me while writing it, let us know down in the comments, tell us your favorite part, or which line made you feel something. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Afro-k Story House if you're not already part of the family, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late for a hardened heart to soften. We'll see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves, besties.